Welcome to the second presentation looking at the issue of whether or not Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, was the son of Elizabeth I. Analysis of the poem and the cartouche in the pregnancy portrait points strongly in that direction, and in this video I'm going to look into the arguments for and against such a possibility. One thing is certain, there is no definite answer. If there were, it would be established fact. Trying to decide on the parentage of an individual 400 years ago poses a whole set of challenges, not least of which being the strict state censorship at the time. Superimposed on this are modern issues. Entire university livelihoods rest on the status quo being maintained. Claiming that Edward de Vere wrote the works of Shakespeare is one thing. Claiming that the royal succession was flawed is quite another. This is St. Peter's Church in Titchfield, near Southampton. And within this church is the family monument to the Earls of Southampton. How then to assess the issue of the parentage of Henry Wriothesley? Well, unless at some point someone has permission to take DNA samples from Henry and his father from their remains encased in lead coffins in their family vault somewhere below the floor of this chapel, then any evidence we can have is only circumstantial. Such a request was made in 2000, but it was declined. Before embarking on the main part of this presentation, I'd like to discuss some legal concepts. Bear with me, this is relevant. In the legal world, there are two levels of proof. One used in civil law and the second in criminal law. In the former, proof rests on the balance of probability. If, for example, it is more likely than not that something is true, i.e. more than a 50% chance, then this is taken as proof. In the latter, criminal law, proof rests on an individual being beyond reasonable doubt of having committed a crime, the decision being usually taken by a jury of 12 unbiased citizens who reach their decision based solely on the evidence presented to them. The next terms to grasp are direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. In simple terms, if someone sees it raining, this is direct evidence of what is happening. If someone inside sees others coming in wet from the street, then this is circumstantial evidence. The observer has to make an inference from the information obtained. Direct evidence for events 400 years ago is hard to come by, particularly if steps have been taken to conceal it. Circumstantial evidence is no less valid if the amount or weight of it is great, allowing a reasonable conclusion to be drawn. In the case of the identity of William Shakespeare, sceptics of the Stratford man express reasonable doubt that he wrote the plays, and many have signed a declaration to this effect. This is in the face of overwhelming circumstantial evidence that Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was the man behind the pen name. Why then is the case not proved? What we have is a situation not unlike trench warfare. Opposing sides of this type of argument dig in by rehearsing their own viewpoints, and they lob criticism at the other side across the no man's land of a bemused public, lost in the cynical fog of intellectual warfare. There is no final arbiter, as so much is at stake, both personally and financially. There are not 12 good people who can decide the case is proven by assessing the evidence given to them. Based on this, I can only apologise if I add to the fog surrounding the parentage of Henry Wriothesley. How far you might be prepared to move along the path of truth is up to you. I seem to have painted myself into a corner by embarking on the analysis of the pregnancy portrait. I wasn't expecting to critically examine the case for Henry Wriothesley, but having got this far, there seems no escape. So here goes. The image on the right is of Queen Elizabeth in 1575, at around the time when some authors believe that she could have been pregnant. On the left is Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton in 1594, when he was 21. Now I've divided this talk up into several broad sections with more detailed analysis within each. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the birth and early life of Henry Wriothesley. Secondly, about the Tudor prince theory. Thirdly, I'm going to look at the court of Queen Elizabeth in 1573. And then to look at some circumstantial evidence making Henry Wriothesley something special. And then we'll look at a new analysis of what might have occurred. There are two respected biographies of Henry Wriothesley. The first is the Life of Henry, 3rd Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron, by Charlotte Carmichael Stopes, written in 1922. The second is Shakespeare and the Earl of Southampton, by Ackrig in 1968. So let's start with his birth and early life. Here we're looking at one side of the family monument. On the left is Thomas Wriothesley, 1st Earl of Southampton, and on the right is his wife, Jane Chain. They had 3 sons, of whom only one survived to adulthood, and there were 5 daughters, one of whom married Thomas Radcliffe, 3rd Earl of Sussex, who I will return to later. Here is the other side of the monument with Jane at the top. Below is Henry, the 2nd Earl of Southampton, and curiously there are no paintings of him. And below is the young Henry, the 3rd Earl, and his sister Mary. The 2nd Earl's father died young in 1550, and he remained with his mother for a further 10 years. She was a strict Catholic, and the young Earl was brought up in this religion and remained a devout Catholic for the rest of his life. In 1560 he became a ward of court to Sir William More of Loseley and reached his majority in 1566, aged 20. The same year he married the 13-year-old Mary Brown, who was the daughter of Anthony Brown, 1st Viscount Montague, and Jane Radcliffe, who in turn was the daughter of Robert Radcliffe, 1st Earl of Sussex. That same family name turns up again. This is the family home of the Montagues, Cowdray House. In 1568, the 2nd Earl regained his estate, consisting of 6 properties, bringing in between £2,000 and £3,000 a year. He's said to have lived a lavish lifestyle. He maintained a London residence in Holborn, near what is now Bloomsbury Square, and a country estate at Titchfield Abbey in Hampshire. This had been converted from an abbey into a fine Tudor mansion. His Catholic faith put him at odds with Queen Elizabeth, and in October 1571 he was arrested for being involved in the Ridolfi plot to depose her and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. He was confined in the Tower of London for 18 months. He was released on May 1st, 1573, into the hands of his former guardian, Sir William More, at Loseley, which is 22 miles north of Cowdray. On the 14th of July, he was allowed to reside with his father-in-law at Cowdray, although his movements were restricted. On the 6th of October, he wrote to Sir William More to to announce the arrival of his son, born at Cowdray that very day, with the following words: "It has so happened by the sudden seizing of my wife today, we could not by possibility have your wife present as we had desired. Yet I have thought good to impart unto you such good comfort as God hath sent me after all my long troubles, which is that this present morning at 3 of the clock my wife delivered a goodly boy. God bless him. If your wife will take the pains to visit her, we shall be mighty glad of her company. From Cowdray, this present Tuesday, 1573, your assured friend, H. Southampton." The letter reveals that they had planned to have the wife of Sir William present at the birth, but because of the suddenness of the event, she was unable to attend. C.S. Stopes tells us that she found no evidence of a baptism for Henry III, Earl of Southampton, and no evidence for the birth or death of a second child. There are only 2 references to Henry III, Earl during his childhood. The first was in 1574, when he, named Harry, was left money from his grandmother, and secondly in 1577, when the Earl estranged himself from his wife, believing that she had been unfaithful. The second Earl was extending his estate by building a house in Dogmasfield, and Mary was reported as being in the company of another man, and she was warned not to see him again. She was subsequently accused of infidelity with a common man called Donsame, and was banished by the Earl from his estate, and she lived under close surveillance nearby. She did not see Henry again until after the death of his father. The cause of the rumours concerning the Countess of Southampton was attributed by Charlotte Stopes to one Thomas Dimmock, a trusted gentleman's servant of the second Earl. By all accounts, the second Earl was quite a weak man, and he became dangerously dependent on Thomas Dimmock. The cause of the Earl's death at the age of 39 is uncertain. He's reported to have died at home, and that 2 months previously he was perfectly well. Both his son and daughter Mary were said to have been present at his death. He is said to have lovingly blessed them, and they wept and wailed at his death. Thomas Dimmock was made an executor of the will, and without knowledge of the other executors he set out, proving the document, to ensure that he was paid his share. His request was denied, and a settlement was finally reached between the Countess and the executors, under which Dimmock retained the Earl's generous bequests to him, but agreed to relinquish administration of the Earl's estate. He lived in some comfort on a lodge in the estate. Henry's father died 2 days before his own 8th birthday. Thus, on the 4th of October 1581, he became 3rd Earl of Southampton. His mother remained a widow during nearly the whole of his minority. The young Earl became a royal ward on the death of his father, and Lord Burleigh, the treasurer, acted as his guardian in his capacity as master of the Court of Wards. As I discussed in an earlier presentation, this was a ruse drawn up initially by Henry VIII to extract money from the landed gentry. The Southampton estates would have been managed by another courtier. In this case, it was Charles Howard, 2nd Baron Howard of Effingham, who was allowed to keep the proceeds. They would be returned to the ward when aged 21 on payment of a large fee, but a high proportion of the income would then be taken by the state. Like Edward de Vere a generation before, Henry would have lived with Lord Burleigh in his house on the Strand, and would have been regularly attending at the court of Elizabeth. In practice, he became one of her children. He would have received the finest education possible, being tutored by great experts in their fields. He would have shared his childhood with Lord Burleigh's granddaughter, Elizabeth de Vere, and a young man by the name of Robert Devereux, the future Earl of Essex. At the age of 12, in the autumn of 1586, he was admitted to St John's College, Cambridge. He remained at the university for 4 years, graduating at 16 in 1589. Before leaving college, he entered his name as a student at Gray's Inn. Soon afterwards, he took into his pay and patronage John Florio, the well-known author and Italian tutor. According to Florio, the Earl quickly acquired a thorough knowledge of Italian. About 1590, when he was hardly more than 17, he was presented to Queen Elizabeth, who showed him kindly notice, and her favourite, the Earl of Essex, afterwards displayed a brotherly interest in his welfare, which proved in the course of time a doubtful blessing. In the autumn of 1592, he was in the throng of noblemen which accompanied Elizabeth to Oxford, and was recognised as the most handsome and accomplished of all young lords who frequented the royal presence. So what is the Tudor Prince theory? Just for clarity, this is also known as the Tudor Rose theory, but I will use the name Tudor Prince throughout, as it seems to me to make more sense. In 1920, a schoolmaster who taught English by the name of John Thomas Looney published a book entitled Shakespeare Identified. In it, working from the principle of the necessary attributes of the author of the Shakespeare works, he identified Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, as the author William Shakespeare. His analysis was received with a very mixed reception. Most researchers agreed, however, that the fair youth of the sonnets was Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. The intense relationship between the young Earl and Shakespeare posed one great issue, and that was whether or not it was the type of homosexual relationship described in Greek times as that between an older man and young ones, going under the term of pederasty. An alternative view was advanced, and this was the relationship between a father and a son. The theory was advanced further by Percy Allen in England in 1947 in his book Talks with Elizabethans, and by Dorothy and Charlton Ogborn in America in 1952 in their book entitled The Star of England. Both asserted that Henry Wriothesley was the son of Elizabeth I and Edward de Vere. The theory was an attempt to explain the many inconsistencies in the life story of England's greatest poet, culminating in his being ostracised from Tudor society and airbrushed from history. Unfortunately, their views split the Oxfordian faction, the group which believed that de Vere was the true poet. These divisions remain to this day. There are those, mostly in America, who believe that Elizabeth I bore a child fathered by Edward de Vere, most prominent being Hank Whitmore, who has reinterpreted the sonnets from this viewpoint in his book The Monument. Some proponents have extended the theory to include de Vere himself as the son of Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour, as depicted in Roland Emmerich's 2011 film Anonymous. Sometimes this is referred to as Tudor Prince too. Few in England subscribe to these views, most believing that it clouds the issue of the authorship of the Shakespeare works. The views of earlier researchers were added to by Elizabeth Sears in her 1991 book Shakespeare and the Tudor Rose. Proponents of the Tudor Prince theory set out their views on how the birth of the son of Elizabeth and Edward de Vere had been concealed, and how he had been inserted into the Wriothesley family. In essence, they proposed that the birth took place in May or June of 1574, for reasons which I'll explain shortly. Factual information leading to this proposal came from several sources. Firstly, contemporary letters written by Gilbert and Lord Francis Talbot to their father, the Earl of Shrewsbury, in 1593 and 1594. George Talbot was the fourth husband of Bess of Hardwicke, and at that time was under the spell of their charge, Mary Queen of Scots. A second source was from the writings of John Strype in 1735-7. In his book entitled Annals of the Reformation and Establishment of Religion, etc. Strype was a man of the church who had access to the papers of William Cecil. He published his life works in 59 volumes, so he was always in a bit of a rush. The third source was John Nichols. In 1788, in his work The Progresses and Public Processions of Queen Elizabeth, the last edition of which was in 1823. The main difficulty was to explain how a birth could have been concealed in someone whose life was so public. Elizabeth Sears, relying on the Ogburns research, presented her case. In May of the year 1574, however, Queen Elizabeth, just starting out on her summer procession, surprisingly interrupted her royal progress and dismissed her retinue, ordering Lord Burghley to remain in London. She retired to Havering Bower, a royal palace near Romford. She went on to say, the Queen and her favourite, the young Earl of Oxford, retired to Havering. There they remained in seclusion for several weeks before the Queen resumed her royal progress early in July. Although there is no official record of this period, from the end of May to July, there is circumstantial evidence that a child was born to the Queen and the Earl of Oxford at this time. The Ogburns believed that the child was born in June, quoting a letter written on June the 28th, 1574, by Lord Talbot to his father. The Queen remaineth sad and pensive in the month of June. She was so troubled for some important matters then before her. It was thought that she would go to Bristol. Mr. Hatton, not well in health, took this opportunity to get leave to go to Spa in Belgium, and Dr. Julio, the Queen's court physician, with him, whereat the Queen showed herself very pensive and very unwilling to grant him leave, for he was her favourite. The Ogburns believed that the Queen wanted to get Christopher Hatton out of the way in time for the birth. Sir Christopher Hatton was indeed a favourite and vied with Edward de Vere for the attention of the Queen, as we shall see later. This argument, of course, raises another problem. I'm sure you've realised that the main events occurred in two separate years. The birth of Henry Wriothesley in October of 1573 and the proposed birth of Elizabeth's son in mid-1574. So we have two births 9 months apart, making it much more difficult to explain a switch. An attempted explanation is that Mary Brown's child, the real Earl of Southampton, may have died or been replaced. Charlotte Stopes, who had full access to the Wriothesley family archives for her 1922 book, could find no evidence of a second child. It's hard to imagine that the second Earl and his wife accepting their natural son being banished at the age of 9 months. One argument was that all babies of the gentry were cared for by wet nurses in their own homes for up to 2 years, and so babies could easily be exchanged as their mothers would not be able to recognise them. But this is hardly likely, I think. I should say something more about Thomas Dimmock, the second Earl's servant, at this point. The Dimmock family of Scrivelsby in Lincoln were an illustrious family tracing back to the 14th century. They held the ceremonial role of the king or queen's champion, a role which challenges anyone who opposes the right of an heir to the throne. Supporters of the Tudor prince theory have declared that Thomas Dimmock was a member of this family, and that he was a plant in order to ensure that the young prince was kept safe. He was a lawyer and an associate of the Queen. In fact, all of this is untrue. This is the Dimmock family tree published in 1894. The important bits are highlighted in yellow. There was only one Thomas Dimmock born to this family in the latter half of the 16th century. He was the great-grandson of Sir Edward Dimmock, and he was born after 1599, and he was admitted to Gray's Inn in 1609. The Thomas Dimmock in Hampshire does not belong to this family, and was what he appeared to be, a servant on the make, with an over-reliant master. So this is a brief summary of the foundations on which the Tudor prince theory was built. It's true that there are many examples from the life of Henry Wriothesley and contemporary literature which can be interpreted as supporting his status, but without a believable explanation of the circumstances surrounding his birth, then they carry little weight. So is the explanation I've outlined adequate to do this? No, it isn't, and I'm about to explain why. In an article entitled "Rough Winds Do Shake, a fresh look at the Tudor prince theory," published in 1996, Diana Price made a strong argument against a birth in 1574. She pointed out that the chronicler Strype incorrectly interpreted the letters of Lord Talbot by combining extracts from letters in both 1573 and 1574. Then Nichols copied him. In truth, Sir Christopher Hatton went to Spa in 1573, not 1574. The planned stay at Havering Castle with Edward de Vere did not take place in 1574 or at any other time. The reason was this: the death of Charles IX of France from tuberculosis in 1574. It was this that led to the Queen's melancholy. Now this lady is Catherine de' Medici, the hugely powerful member of the Italian Medici family. She was the husband of one French king and the mother of three. She had floated the idea of a marriage between Elizabeth and her youngest son, Francis, Duke of Anjou and Alençon. Elizabeth initially refused, but then entered protracted negotiations which helped strengthen her alliance against Spain. The death of Charles IX, his brother, threw these plans into confusion. I should say this does not appear to have been a match of love. Francis was 19 and the Queen 40. He was disfigured from smallpox and was under 5 feet tall. The Queen referred to him as her frog, and at the time of his brother's death, the Queen was engaged in a complicated arrangement to meet him. Now all the negotiations were reported back to France by Bertrand de Salignac, Seigneur de la Mothe-Fenelon, referred to in the court records as La Mothe. During May and June of 1574, La Mothe reported frequently to Paris, following personal meetings with the Queen. By this stage she would have been in the later stages of pregnancy and then given birth. The Queen remained at Hampton Court and then Greenwich until the end of June, when her summer progress began. The arguments of the Ogburns and Elizabeth Sears for a birth in 1574 really do not stand up to this type of scrutiny. They arose because of a misinterpretation of the facts. It became trapped in a time frame where the opportunity for concealing a birth was absent. There was a series of letters back and forth between opposing sides of the argument following Diana Price's publication, and these were over other circumstantial evidence, but without foundations, the case was lost. Another piece of evidence against Elizabeth I being the mother of Henry Wriothesley at any time was in this painting of him while imprisoned in the Tower of London between 1601 and 1603. In fact, it was performed after his release from prison. There are many interesting features of the painting, but the one of interest here is his face. By comparison with a painting of his mother Mary, it reveals that there's a very remarkable likeness. In Sonnet 3, Edward de Vere says of Henry Wriothesley, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." So it's all over then. Well, not exactly, because the portrait of Mary Brown was carried out when she was just 13, and that of Henry when he was 30. Is it not a little odd that they should be so similar? Here is something else. This is an image of his face, and I've drawn on it a grid and marked the eye centres. The grid defines features in both horizontal and vertical planes. By scaling different images, the grid allows us comparison. This type of technique is subject to many pitfalls. However, these findings are quite interesting. On the left is Henry when he was aged 27, and on the right when he is 46. And here is the level of the chin in the tower portrait. In both the outer images, the mouth line is very similar, but the chins are shorter, albeit covered by some stubble. This is the same image on the left, and here I have plotted a map of the shape of the face. In the centre is Mary Brown, scaled to the same size and blended with the original image. On the right is the map overlain on her face. A perfect fit. Is it too perfect? In any way, why have yourself painted when you were in prison after you'd been released? Could this be a clever way of demonstrating the parentage of Henry on the succession of James I? If you like, a final nail in the coffin of his possible claim to the throne. Now we've seen these two images before, and I have to say that this one of the Queen is one of my favourites. She looks both human and rather vulnerable. If we apply the same techniques of overlaying a grid from Henry's portrait, there are striking similarities in the position of the facial features, in particular the shape of the mouths. So I would suggest from images the game is far from over. Another argument put forward was that the Queen was too old to become pregnant. This is Sir Arthur Keith's health chart of Elizabeth compiled from original documents. In the early part of 1572, she had a leg ulcer, which healed some 5 years later. She had amenorrhea in 1577 and was having climacteric swoons in 1585. So, although unlikely, she could have had a child in the early 1570s. So if we remove the constraint on timing of a pregnancy and birth from 1574, we can look more closely at the year 1573. Fortunately, various archives for this period are now easily accessible. These include the Calendar of State Papers Domestic, the Calendar of State Papers Foreign, and the Elizabethan Court Day by Day by Mariam Colthorpe. There are also various biographies. We should remember that the information gleaned from these sources may not be entirely accurate, as it has been extracted from the original document, which themselves may have been altered. So let's look in detail at what the Queen was doing in 1573. In summary, the Queen spent a month at Hampton Court in January, followed by 3 weeks at Greenwich Palace in February. She then went on a 10-day short progress close to London, and from the 9th of March until the 15th of July she was at Greenwich. I've extracted from the records the occasions when the Queen was recorded to have given audience or been visited by senior courtiers. You can see quite clearly the frequent visits up until mid-March, and then again just before the summer progress in mid-July. On the 30th of March, the French envoy to Scotland, Verac, had an audience with the Queen. 3 weeks later, on the 24th of April, the Queen was seen attending St George's Garter Day ceremonies, and 2 weeks later, on May the 5th, the French ambassador Lamoth had an audience. A second period is between June and July. On the 9th of June, the Queen summoned her council to complain about the treatment of Verac by the Scottish. On the 18th of June, a christening is recorded, the Queen being a godmother to the child. Records do not say whether or not she attended, and children may have had several godparents. Nearly 4 weeks later, on July the 12th, the French ambassador had an audience. These 2 periods, free of formal visits from outsiders, would provide adequate time for the Queen to have given birth discreetly. Obviously, the Queen was not alone at court, so we need to know the nature of the Queen's life at the Palace of Greenwich. This is a sketch of the Tudor Palace of Greenwich, viewed from the north across the river. It was T-shaped, the main facade looking north onto the river. Running perpendicular were 2 great towers, which overlooked the tilt yard seen on the left of the image. At the eastern end of the palace was the chapel. In the centre was the main gatehouse, 3 stories high, which projected forwards into the river, and behind this, 5 stories high, the towers of the royal apartments. At the western end of the palace and adjoining it was the Church of the Observant Friars, noticed by its fine steeple. Behind the western end of the palace were the formal gardens, and in the distance, on the hill, was the tower built by Humphrey of Gloucester. Here is the view from the south. The great towers of the tilt yard and the gatehouse are now more easily defined, as is the gardens and the Church of the Observant Friars. In the foreground is a separate gatehouse from which the Queen used to watch military displays. The layout of the interior of the palace is unclear. The royal apartments were in the upper story of the building. The Queen used the King's apartments, which overlooked the river. This diagram comes from the Royal Palace website. A remarkable insight into how this worked is given in Anna Whitlock's book Elizabeth Bedfellows. The court consisted of 3 distinct areas: the presence chamber, the privy chamber, and the Queen's bedchamber. The presence chamber was usually large and was accessible to anyone entitled to appear at court. It could be filled with courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and others who hoped to catch a glimpse of the Queen and, if possible, press their case. The privy chamber was where the Queen spent most of her time, surrounded by favoured ladies, dealing with business, dancing, playing cards and gossiping. It was heavily guarded. In addition, there were grooms and gentlemen of the bedchamber who took charge of the space both day and night. These formal spaces seem very small at Greenwich, being only about 30 feet square, hardly on the scale of Hampton Court. During the time of Henry VIII, the tower behind the gatehouse was part of his private apartments. It appears to me that this palace was much more intimate, with a substantial private quarters. The Queen's bedchamber was in essence the centre of the court. Here the Queen's natural body was on show in contrast to the formal body of the monarch. She was waited on by ladies of the bedchamber who had the most intimate access to her during eating, bathing and toileting. One usually slept with her or on a truckle bed beside her. They were responsible for dressing the Queen in her elaborate gowns and applying her extensive makeup. The maids of honour were young unmarried women of good birth, usually dressed in white, who provided companionship and entertainment for the Queen in the privy chamber and accompanied her in public. Elizabeth's position as an unmarried female ruler was vulnerable. Whereas in a male ruler, sexual prowess might be considered as a mark of power, in a female monarch it could signal corruption or weakness. Similarly, without an heir, physical illness could cause great instability in the nation. She needed protection, which brings us, of course, to the ladies of the bedchamber. The ladies of the bedchamber were the guardians of the truth as to the health of the Queen, and in turn the stability of the monarchy. Not surprisingly, they were very carefully chosen. Elizabeth's vulnerability was exploited by the Catholic nations ranged against her, leading to rumours of sexual activity with various members of the court, resulting in illegitimate children. This became a long-standing campaign to challenge the Protestant state. There were reports of bribery of some of the ladies of the bedchamber, revealing intimate details of the Queen's life, but it is impossible to disentangle fact from fiction. To complicate matters, not only was the Queen toying with marriage to the Catholic Duke of Alençon, but behind this, of course, was the issue of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the granddaughter of King Henry VIII's sister Margaret, and as Mary Guise had married the French King Francois of Valois in 1558 and was widowed 2 years later. She was in pursuit of her own claim to the throne of England and the return of Catholicism. Commentators have always said that only a virgin queen would have been a suitable wife for a foreign suitor. However, I'm not so sure. This was all about international, political and religious power. Any foreigner marrying the Queen would be king, and rule over England would revert to his nation on the succession. Any previous offspring of the Queen would be sidelined. So let's return to the bedchamber and look more closely at the Queen's confidants, which I think gives an insight into the dedication of these ladies. Catherine Knollys. Catherine was the daughter of Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. Ostensibly her father was William Carey, although it's widely believed that she was the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII. She was at least first cousin to Elizabeth, but probably her half-sister. On Elizabeth's accession, Catherine returned to England from exile with her husband Sir Francis Knollys and her 5 children. Joining her at court were her 2 daughters, Lettice, aged 15, and Elizabeth, 9. And this may be of relevance, as I'll explain later. For the next 10 years, Catherine served the Queen, as well as looking after her 13 children. Lady Catherine Howard was the daughter of Henry Carey, brother of Catherine Knollys. She became a maid of honour under the auspices of her aunt and in 1572 was appointed First Lady of the Bedchamber. She served the Queen for 45 years. Her husband was Charles Howard, 2nd Baron Howard of Effingham, who, as we learned earlier, managed Henry Wriothesley's estates during his wardship. Lady Catherine Cornwallis was born Wriothesley. She was the sister of the 2nd Earl of Southampton. She served the Queen for 30 years, as did her husband Thomas Cornwallis. Both were associated with the royal court. Thomas as a groom porter to the Queen, responsible for organising the activities of the outer chambers of the palace. And Catherine, although a committed Catholic, served the Queen for 30 years and as a result was granted freedom of thought towards the end of the reign. Cat Ashley was the most trusted of Elizabeth's ladies and served as the First Lady of the Bedchamber. She was fiercely loyal, having been imprisoned in the Tower on 2 occasions while defending Elizabeth against allegations of impropriety with her stepfather Thomas Seymour. By this stage, Cat had died, but her influence persisted. Blanche Parry had known Elizabeth throughout her life, looking after her when she was young. She was a very straightforward Welshwoman who never married and remained devoted and loyal to Elizabeth for the rest of her life. After Cat Ashley's death in 1565, Blanche Parry was appointed the chief gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber and was one of those who controlled access to the Queen. She was in charge of the Queen's personal papers, clothes, furs and books. She received presentations of parliamentary bills for the Queen and wrote letters on the Queen's behalf. Blanche Parry's position was at the centre of the court and the conduit to royal power. She was friends with her cousin Sir William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, the Queen's chief adviser, and worked closely with him. Dorothy Stafford married her cousin Sir William Stafford, who was the widower of Mary Boleyn. In 1563 she was appointed Mistress of the Robes to the Queen. She exercised much influence at court. She remained in service for 40 years, and her daughter Elizabeth was a Lady of the Bedchamber. I brought these ladies to your attention to illustrate the rings of devoted protection surrounding the Queen at all times. It's hard to believe that any of these ladies would have betrayed the privacy of the Queen, or indeed let others do so, under pain of death. Now let's think about letters from court. These letters, written between members of the court, shed some light on the events during 1573. Elizabeth Weir, in her biography, Elizabeth the Queen, tells us that after 13 years, the relationship between the Queen and Robert Dudley was no longer passionate, but was replaced by a deep bond of affection. On the surface, he played the part of the adoring suitor, along with Sir Christopher Hatton and Edward de Vere. Hatton deeply resented the favour shown to Oxford, because he believed he stood higher in her affections than anyone else. Hatton's enemies claimed that he had more recourse to the Queen in her privy chamber than reason would suffer if she were so virtuous and well inclined as she made out. In October of 1572, the poet Sir Edward Dyer, a friend of Hatton, had written to him offering advice on dealing with the Queen, and I have paraphrased it slightly. The best and soundest way, in mine opinion, is to put on another mind, to use your suits towards Her Majesty in words, behaviour and deeds, to acknowledge your duty, declaring the reverence which in heart you bear, and never seem deeply to condemn her frailties, but rather joyfully to commend such things as should be in her. Do not show hate for my Lord Chamberlain, that's Oxford, or blame him openly for seeking the Queen's favour. For though in the beginning, when her Majesty sought you, she did bear with rugged dealing of yours, until she'd had what she fancied, yet now, after satiety and fullness, it, that's the rugged dealing, will rather hurt rather than help you. Whereas behaving yourself, as I said before, your place shall keep you in worship, your presence in favour. And you should dwell in the ways to take advantage wisely and honestly, to serve your turn at times. Marry this much, I would advise you to remember, that you use no words of disgrace or reproach towards him, so that he may sleep, thinking all safe, while you do awake and attend your advantages. On the 11th of May of 1573, Gilbert Talbot wrote to his father, George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. The letter gives us information concerning both Robert Dudley and Edward de Vere. My Lord Leicester is very much with Her Majesty, and she shows the same great good affection to him that she was wont. Of late he has endeavoured to please her more than heretofore. There are two sisters now in the court that are very far in love with him, as they have been long, my Lady Sheffield and Frances Howard. They, of like striving who shall love him better, are at great wars together, and the Queen thinketh not well of them, and not the better of him. By this means there are spies over him. In fact, Lady Sheffield had been Dudley's mistress for some time, and they married in May of 1573, although this was kept a secret from the Queen. Gilbert Talbot went on. My Lord of Oxford is lately grown into great credit, for the Queen's Majesty delighteth more in his personage and his dancing and valiantness than any other. I think Sussex, that's Thomas Radcliffe, 3rd Earl of Sussex, doth back him all he can. If it were not for his fickle head, he would pass any of them shortly. My Lady Burleigh unwisely has declared herself, as it were, jealous, which is come to the Queen's ear, whereat she has been not a little offended with her, but now she is reconciled again. At these love matters my Lord Treasurer, that's William Cecil, winketh, and will not meddle in any way. Hatton is still sick. It is thought he will very hardly recover his disease, for it is doubted it is in his kidneys. The Queen goeth almost every day to see how he doth. In addition, there was a letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Queen. Although written in 1584, it has relevance to current events. In the letter, she tells that Bess, Countess of Hardwicke, her keeper, had told her that, firstly, that one, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, to whom she said you had made a promise of marriage before a lady of your chamber, had lain numberless times with you, and that you would never wish to lose the liberty of making love and gratifying yourself with new lovers. Regretting this, said she, that you would not content yourself with Master Hatton and another of this kingdom, that even the Earl of Oxford dare not reconcile himself with his wife for fear of losing the favour which he hoped to receive by courting you. The third is a letter from Hatton himself. It was written to Queen Elizabeth from Spa in Belgium in June of 1573, where Hatton had gone to recover from his illness. He writes, God bless you for ever. The branch of the sweetish bush, presumably a present, I will wear and bear to my life's end. God witness that I feign not. It is a gracious favour most dear, and welcome unto me. Reserve it to the sheep. He hath no tooth to bite, whereas the boar's tusk may both raise and tear. Now, the sheep was one of Elizabeth's pet names for Hatton. Edward de Vere's heraldic animal was the boar. From these three letters, then, we may conclude that the Earl of Oxford was Hatton's rival for Elizabeth's favours, and at that time de Vere was the favourite. It's hard not to get the impression that both Hatton and de Vere had a sexual relationship with the Queen. The State Papers contain the report of a letter from Hatton. Although dated query July, they probably refer to the same letter. Interestingly, he asks if the reports of her illness were true. This is Spa in Belgium. In the original form of the Tudor prince theory, it was supposed that Hatton was sent away to Spa to get him out of the way. Remember, this was wrongly dated as 1574, negating the argument. If, however, a birth took place in 1573, then it may be redeployed. Interestingly, the Queen was well aware of spas at both Bath and Buxton, as she has sent Mary Queen of Scots to the latter on several occasions. Why then did Hatton go to Belgium? You can see from the map that even excluding the Channel crossing, the journey was considerable for a sick man. Hatton left court on the 5th of June 1573 and during the summer sent a number of passionate letters to the Queen. The date of his return to court is not known, but he was certainly in London in October. Critics of the Tudor prince theory have quite reasonably made the point that the Queen would not have been able to hide the visible signs of late pregnancy. So far we've established that there were 2 periods of time where she did not venture outside Greenwich Palace and there were no recorded audiences. It's obvious that the ladies of the Bedchamber would have been aware of such a pregnancy, and it's likely that they would have kept a secret. Less so the maids of honour, who might have been more susceptible to bribery. Failure of the Queen to appear in the presence chamber would have caused comments, and there is no record of any being made. However, removal of such from the records would have been a relatively simple matter. Proponents of the theory have said that the Queen could have worn farthingale dresses to hide the bump, and as pregnancy progressed, the waistline could have been raised. This type of garment was constructed of a series of hoops of increasing size, supported by a fabric. The Spanish farthingale, which was prevalent in the 1570s, was said to have been invented by Joan of Portugal, mistress of the king, in order to hide, guess what, a pregnancy. While effective perhaps until the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, after that the waistline would be virtually under the armpits. Interestingly, in Hans Eworth's portrait of Elizabeth I, dated 1569, she is wearing a Spanish farthingale dress. In order for late pregnancy to have gone unnoticed, the Queen must have remained within the Privy Chamber, where she could have worn loose clothes. So that's it then. On this basis alone, the pregnancy never happened. Well, I'm not so sure. Firstly, the Queen's medical records reveal that she was often very thin. Although thin women put on more weight during pregnancy than fatter ones, the pregnancy is carried forward in the abdomen with less change in the rest of the body. Secondly, we know for a fact that Anne Vavasour, Edward de Vere's mistress, concealed her pregnancy until she gave birth at court. There's something else which has not been considered. I'd like to introduce you to Lettice Knollys and her sister Elizabeth. These 2 sisters came to court when they returned from exile with their mother. Lettice was 10 years younger than the Queen. She'd married Walter Devereux in 1560 and over the next 10 years bore him 5 children. Although the family seat was at Chartley in Staffordshire, she spent time at court when her husband was in Ireland, as he was in 1573. There were rumours of a romance with Robert Dudley from as early as 1565. Elizabeth Knollys was 16 years younger than the Queen. She was appointed Gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber in 1566 and continued in this capacity until 1578, when she married Sir Thomas Layton. Now, both of these ladies, particularly Lettice, bore a striking resemblance to the Queen, as well they might have given their heritage. They were both in close contact with the Queen and were well acquainted with how she spoke and her mannerisms. Could it be possible, therefore, that wearing the clothing and makeup of the Queen, they could have stood in for her? There is no doubt that if a pregnancy took place, Robert Dudley would have known. Given his rather parlous position with both Lady Sheffield and Lettice, it seems likely that he could have been complicit with hiding it. Could he have been responsible for shepherding a stand-in for the Queen on appearances at the present chamber? Then there is that curious letter from Sir Christopher Hatton, asking about the Queen's illness. Could this have been an excuse for not appearing at court? The last thing to consider is that the records that we have available have been subjected to censorship to convey what those in power, i.e. the likes of William Cecil, wanted us to know. Think, for example, of how the papers of Edward de Vere, including his will, mysteriously vanished. It would have been imperative that all record of a royal child fathered by de Vere should be erased. Those unwilling to contemplate such a pregnancy might say that the Queen would not have allowed herself to become pregnant, which of course introduces the subject of Tudor birth control. Well, birth control during the Tudor period was illegal. The Church dictated that sexual relations were to be undertaken only in marriage and only for procreation, and not for pleasure. Therefore, women and men would not need birth control. Such rules did not apply to kings whose sexual urges needed to be met for him to remain in good health. Although it was not illegal, contraception in Tudor period did exist. It consisted of many varied and different methods, including the man withdrawing from the woman before he ejaculated, and the taking of herbs and oils such as oil of mint, oil of rue, oil of savin, and honeysuckle juice. The women could also insert various things into her vagina, such as pepper, wool soaked in vinegar, or bundles of herbs, which would hopefully kill the sperm. A woman might also insert beeswax to cover the entrance to the cervix. The man could also use a type of condom made of lambskin, which was known as a Venus glove. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, is quoted as saying that a woman might meddle with a man and yet conceive no child unless she would herself. But judging by the number of illegitimate children at the time, the methods of contraception were hardly foolproof. Now, what if such a pregnancy were planned? Perhaps not as far-fetched as it seems. Elizabeth, as a female ruler, had a real problem in securing the succession of a Tudor monarch. I've already outlined the risks of taking a foreign husband. The results had been felt following the marriage of Mary Tudor to Philip of Spain. Allowing the monarchy to slip into the hands of the family of Mary, Queen of Scots, risked a return to Catholicism. Marriage to a member of the aristocracy was not without risk either. The monarchy falling into the hands of the mafia-like clutches of one of the powerful families was not an attractive proposition. Robert Dudley, by all accounts, was getting too powerful until he was tainted by the death of his first wife, Amy Robsart, in 1560. If we return to the pregnancy portrait, Elizabeth speaks of the fruit of a love tree, brought up in care as her only hope. A hidden successor, sired by the highest-ranking earl in the kingdom, who had no wish for power, and revealed at an appropriate time, would have been a very clever plan, particularly if no suitable foreign suitor had been found. If the only thing, what I have presented, just raises a little doubt in your mind about the possibility of the Queen bearing a child in 1573, then I would count this as a success. If you move away from the standpoint that the Queen was a virgin and such things could never have happened, then it does open the door to the whole range of circumstantial evidence of such an event taking place. This evidence is extensive, but I will give you just some examples to consider. The sonnets become very much easier to understand if Henry Wriothesley were the son of Edward de Vere. They are then free of the cloud of pederasty. De Vere tells us that he is consumed with self-love, and he transfers this to the fair youth, viewed as a younger version of himself, which of course he could have been. The theme of preservation of the youth's virtue for eternity fits with the concept of setting the record straight, as I believe does the pregnancy portrait. Look, for example, at Sonnet 81. Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I, once gone, to all the world must die. The earth can yield me but a common grave, when you entombed in men's eyes shall lie. Your monument shall be my gentle verse, which eyes not yet created shall read. Surely this was not destined to remain in a secret diary. I suspect that the original sonnet booklet escaped the censorship of his works and emerged when his house, King's Place, Hackney, was sold in 1609. Had it not survived, it's likely that there would have been no authorship debate or questions over the succession. The relationship between de Vere and Southampton did not, of course, run smoothly in the 1590s, to the extent that Southampton probably fathered a child by de Vere's erstwhile mistress, Penelope Rich, a child which was brought up as Henry de Vere, later the 18th Earl of Oxford. Some authors have opined that this scandal alone was sufficient to have led to de Vere being ostracised and censored, leading to his retreat into the world of William Shakespeare. I'm not so sure about this. I think the bigger issue was the succession and the roles of William and Robert Cecil, kingmakers to James I, who stood to have a great political power and untold wealth. Here is another sonnet to consider, Sonnet 33. Here is another sonnet to consider, Sonnet 33. This sonnet uses the metaphor of the sun moving across the sky, enlightening the morning, but then being hidden by clouds so that its face could not be seen. A heavenly sun stained. In the second half of the sonnet, de Vere tells us that his sun did shine, but he had him only for an hour before the cloud masked him, an earthly sun stained. Full many a glorious morning have I seen flatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye, kissing with golden face the meadows green, gilding pale streams with heavenly alchemy. Anon permit the basest clouds to ride with ugly wrack on his celestial face, and from the forlorn world his visage hide, stealing unseen to west with this disgrace. Even so my sun one early morn did shine, with all triumphant splendour on my brow, but out alack he was but 1 hour mine. The region cloud hath masked him from me now. Yet him for this my love no whit disdaineth. Sons of the world may stain, when heaven's sun staineth. It's hard not to interpret this sonnet as referring to a son of Edward de Vere, taken away from him. The term region cloud in line 12 seems a curious one, as it consists of 2 nouns, until of course you realise that the Italian word regio means royal, derived from the Latin regere, to rule. The term is then royal cloud. In the early 1590s, Thomas Nash dedicated his poem The Choice of Valentines to the Earl of Southampton with the following words: "Pardon, sweet flower of matchless poetry, and fairest bud that red rose ever bore. Nay, blame my verse of loose unchastity, for painting forth the things that hidden are." The first line can be interpreted as Southampton, the sun, the flower, of the only writer of matchless poetry, Edward de Vere, and the Queen labelled as the red rose who birthed him. The red rose was not just symbolic of the Queen, but also the House of Lancaster. You can see E. Vere hidden in the second line of the dedication. In fact, the following partial anagram can be derived from the letters of line 2. E. Vere, father to a treasured son. In the third line, Vere appears again in the word verse. Just remove the S from the word verse, and the line reads as, "Nay, blame my Vere of loose unchastity." In other words, don't blame my Vere of loose unchastity. Now look at the fourth line, for painting things that hidden are. The word painting could be a reference to the pregnancy portrait, even though this poem was probably written several years before the portrait was painted. Could it have been planned for some years? Also in the last line is fourth T. You will remember that de Vere considered himself to be the fourth T hidden in the triple tau symbol. Nash is recording for posterity things that are hidden, i.e. the state's secret that a virgin queen bore a son. Nash portrayed Henry Wriothesley's origin clearly and straightforwardly, without subtlety. No alternative interpretation of this poem has been offered by academic scholars for the last 400 years. Thomas Nash was a colleague and close literary associate of Edward de Vere. He and de Vere's other 10 university wits were bold writers, unafraid of Cecil's censorship, who incorporated current historical truths into their writings, including Shakespeare authorship clues. There was undoubtedly something special about Henry Wriothesley. Tucked away in a book proposing the Earl of Derby as Shakespeare, the late author John Rolette devotes 2 chapters to Henry Wriothesley, in which he makes 3 very interesting observations about the young Earl. They've been largely ignored in the UK, but in the light of my own findings I will describe them to you. The first is about Knights of the Garter. The Order of the Garter was the highest order of chivalry in the Tudor court. There were 24 members, and all had distinguished themselves either politically or militarily. They were senior members of the aristocracy. On ceremonial occasions they wore a garter on the left leg, on which was inscribed "Honi soit qui mal y pense." Around the neck they wore a chain made of alternating Tudor roses and knots, from which hung a figure of St. George slaying the dragon. Knighthood of the Garter was awarded by the Queen, and votes were cast by members of the order. In May of 1593, a Philip Gaudy wrote a letter to his elder brother, High Sheriff of Norfolk. In it he reports that the Earl of Southampton, aged just 19, had been nominated. The compliment of nomination was unprecedented outside the circle of the sovereign's kinsmen. and showed that people were expecting the Queen to make Henry a Garter Knight, the precedent for which had been set by Henry VIII. He made his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy a Garter Knight at the age of 6. In 1596, having performed no service to the state, Henry received 10 out of 12 votes, presumably because the members thought he was a good chance of success, but he was not appointed. In subsequent years, his votes were low. However, one of the first tasks of James I was to appoint him. In addition, when James arrived at Hinchingbrook, Southampton was chosen to carry the sword of state. He was held in an esteem which can only be explained by his birth. In 1593, the poet George Peele published a poem entitled The Honour of the Garter. It ran to 364 lines, extolling the virtues of those who had held the honour over 300 years. Then, quite out of context, he writes this: "Gentle Rosalie, Southampton's star, I wish all fortune that in Cynthia's eye, Cynthia, the glory of the western world, with all the stars in her fair firmament, bright may he rise and shine immortally." Cynthia was widely used to refer to the Queen, and Henry was the only living person apart from her that's mentioned in the poem. After another 150 lines about historical figures, the 5 persons who were awarded the knighthood on that day were mentioned. To be immortalised at the age of 19 was quite something. The poem ends in Latin, the translation of which is: "Stay far away from here, detested turmoil," referring to civil war. "While the nettle yields coarse weeds, the offspring of the rose is noble." Now, the rose was the flower par excellence of Elizabeth. It's hard not to conclude that the poem is a plea to the Queen to recognise him as her heir, thereby using her power to dispel the prospect of a civil war over the succession. Henry visited Oxford University with the Queen in 1592. John Sandford, chaplain of Magdalen College, wrote some celebratory verses in Latin, the title of which was The Idylls of Apollo and the Muses. One verse concerns the young lord. John Rolette was intrigued by the use of the rare word dynasta. In the 16th century, a dynasty referred quite specifically to a line of kings and princes. It did not gain its wider meaning until 200 years later. The translation taking this into account can be read as follows: "After him there follows a hereditary prince of illustrious lineage, whom as a great hero the rich house of Southampton lawfully lays claim to as one of its own. There was present no one more comely, no young man more outstanding in learning, although his mouth scarcely blooms with tender down." The use of the term lawfully lays claim is very revealing. Had he been the natural son of the Southamptons, this would have been automatic. It implies that because they adopted him, he was theirs lawfully, irrespective of parentage. He was both a prince and an earl. John Rolette makes the point that such a poem would not have been sanctioned if the university had felt it unsafe to do so. The implication of George Peele's poem and this one is that it was widely known in London and Oxford that he was the son of the Queen. So let's try and summarise my findings. There is insufficient information in the records to demonstrate that the Queen bore a child in 1573. There is, however, sufficient space in her recorded activities for this to have occurred. Many of the arguments raised by Diana Price over the year 1574 can be set aside. 1573 provides an opportunity. The relationship between Elizabeth and Edward de Vere was at its height in late 1572 and early 1573. Sir Christopher Hatton was a rival for her attention, but appears that moving him to Spa could have been helpful. If such a birth took place, I would suggest it was somewhere between the 9th of June and the 12th of July. Such a child could then have been put in the care of a wet nurse. The Queen was surrounded by intensely loyal supporters, who, for her and their own interests, could have helped her. William Cecil, the self-serving First Minister with much to lose. Robert Dudley in a secret marriage to Lady Sheffield. The formidable ladies of the bed and privy chambers, and other family connections. There were several people who were in close contact with the Queen and the Wriothesley family, who were in a position to ease the process of child substitution. This is Thomas Radcliffe, 3rd Earl of Sussex. He was a leading courtier of Elizabeth I. He was also like a surrogate father to the young Edward de Vere, taking him with him during the suppression of the rebellion of the Northern Earls, that's Northumberland and Westmoreland, in 1569. It was he who was supporting Edward de Vere when he was courting the Queen. In 1572, he became Lord Chamberlain, being responsible for managing the royal household, and was in close contact with the Queen until his death in 1583. Oh, and his first wife was Elizabeth Wriothesley, a daughter of the 1st Earl of Southampton. This is Charles Howard, 2nd Baron Howard of Effingham. We've already met his wife, Catherine Carey, who was in the Queen's household for 45 years. He was a cousin to Elizabeth and very close to her. It was he who was granted the wardship of the young Earl of Southampton. Indeed, it was he who pressed the Queen about the succession when she was on her deathbed. The Howards lived very close indeed to Lady Catherine Cornwallis, née Wriothesley, sister to the 2nd Earl and Lady of the Bedchamber. With such powerful and family and political loyalties, I think it's possible to understand how the Queen could have both supported and protected. These people were well aware of the inner workings of the household of the 2nd Earl of Southampton and the circumstances of his wife's pregnancy. Let's think now about the Wriothesley family scenarios. The first scenario is that Mary the Countess was never pregnant at all, but a royal child was introduced into the family after a respectable period of time to argue that the 2nd Earl was the father. I think this is very unlikely. The 2nd Earl was definitely expecting a delivery of a baby, as expressed in his letter to Sir William Moore. In turn, Lady Moore would have expected to have seen a newborn at her next visit, which presumably took place soon afterwards. So there was definitely a newborn baby in the household on October the 6th, 1573. Secondly, the father of Mary's child was someone else. In later years she was known to be associated with other men, leading to a schism in her marriage. In nearly 10 years of marriage there was only one living child, Mary, born in 1567, and it does seem odd that the next pregnancy was in a period of forced separation. However, I think it's highly likely the 2nd Earl would have banished both Mary and the child if he did not think it was his, irrespective of any outside influence. This leaves us with scenario 3, that the child was the natural son of the 2nd Earl. We should remember that the Wriothesley family were recusant Catholics, and the second Earl had been involved in the Ridolfi plot to unset the Queen, so they would not have been in a strong position to resist any role they were expected to play. Having said that, they surely would have resisted a natural son being replaced by another, even if he were royal. Everyone is persuadable, of course, particularly if life and freedom, status and wealth were at stake. More so if an adopted child were later to be recognised as the next king of England. We shall never know what transpired, but there is a mechanism for substitution, switching the children at the wet nurse, the age difference being only 3 months. Perhaps this was even without the knowledge of the second Earl and his wife. I'm not saying that this happened, merely that it could have done. It is not so much what, but who could have gone wrong with the Tudor prince. And I think it was Henry Wriothesley. He was not the sort of heir which the Queen expected, and she would not recognise him. He was narcissistic, sexually promiscuous, kept treasonous company, and married well below his status. In this context, the first 17 sonnets imploring him to marry and have a family might be seen as damage limitation exercise by Edward de Vere, spawned by Elizabeth's reluctance to recognise him because of his behaviour. Similarly, the grovelling dedications to Venus and Adonis and Lucrece attempts, if you like, to rehabilitate his reputation. Unfortunately, as the years rolled by, things went from bad to worse, with Henry Wriothesley sentenced to death for his part in the Essex Rebellion of 1601, commuted to life in the Tower until the Queen died in 1603. Some have argued that it was probable that the scandalous pregnancy of Penelope Rich, de Vere's erstwhile mistress in 1593, by Henry Wriothesley, and the subsequent adoption of the child as the 18th Earl of Oxford led to the disappearance of Edward de Vere from public life. Scandalous though it was, I'm not so sure that this would have been enough. I believe it was the succession in which Edward de Vere and Henry Wriothesley were caught up, the aim of the Cecils being to keep Henry Wriothesley from being recognised as the next king. De Vere and Wriothesley needed to be silenced, and James VI of Scotland lined up to be taken over. This scenario would neatly explain why Edward de Vere vanished in 1593, except for a couple of official engagements later in life, and the figure of William Shakespeare appeared, just like Philomela, described in the previous presentation, finding new ways of expression. You'll remember that Robert Devereux was the Queen's favourite in the 1590s, and as such he must have been aware of the issue of the succession. He was certainly in open conflict with the Cecils over their play for continued power under the next ruler. Henry Wriothesley was Robert Devereux's protégé. The 1601 rebellion appears to have taken place out of frustration over Robert Cecil's successful manoeuvring. There is no doubt that Devereux's sister Penelope Rich was playing off both sides by corresponding with James VI, but just perhaps the plan all along was to put Henry Wriothesley on the throne. Although Devereux, along with several others, lost their heads, curiously Henry Wriothesley did not. After the initial largesse, James I was very wary of him. Edward de Vere died on June 24, 1604, and later that evening Henry Wriothesley was arrested, his papers seized and scrutinised, and he was interrogated in the Tower. According to the French ambassador, King James had gone into a complete panic and could not sleep that night, even though he had a guard of his Scots posted around his quarters. Presumably to protect his heir, he sent orders to Prince Henry that he must not stir out of his chamber. Henry was released on June the 25th, the day after the arrest. No documents that relate to this episode survive. Were selective documents burned? Then there is the matter of the wills. Neither that of Edward de Vere nor Henry Wriothesley have been found, something unheard of in Elizabethan nobility. It would have been entirely reasonable that Edward de Vere would have wanted to leave behind clues to the real underlying sequence of events. His papers and records were destroyed, but I believe that two items escaped censorship by chance: the sonnets, which were left tucked away in his house after death, and the pregnancy portrait, because its meaning is so well hidden. The clues in the painting and the poem within it point strongly to a Tudor prince. Following on from all of the clues revealed in the portrait, I believe that my study of the daily life of the Queen during 1573 reveals an opportunity for a pregnancy to have occurred and been concealed. My consideration of the birth of a child to the Southamptons in October of 1573 provides a mechanism by which an exchange could have been made. If we return to my original point about levels of proof in legal terms, I can ask myself the following questions. Was Henry Wriothesley the natural son of Elizabeth I and Edward de Vere? For certain? No. Beyond reasonable doubt? No. More likely than not? Yes. Circumstantial evidence is strong. The multitude of other contemporary references and hints as to the real pedigree of Henry Wriothesley, of which I've only given a few examples, can now be considered in a new light. What do you think? Thank you very much for getting this far. I hope you found it an interesting journey. It would have been entirely reasonable that Edward de Vere would have wanted to leave behind clues to the real underlying sequence of events. His papers and records were destroyed, but I believe that two items escaped censorship by chance: the sonnets, which were left tucked away in his house after death, and the pregnancy portrait, because its meaning is so well hidden. The clues in the painting and the poem within it strongly point to a Tudor prince. Following on from all of the clues revealed in the portrait, I believe that my study of the daily life of the Queen during 1573 reveals an opportunity for a pregnancy to have occurred and been concealed. My consideration of the circumstances of the birth of a child to the Southamptons in October of 1573 provides us with the mechanism by which an exchange could have been made. If we return to my original points about the levels of proof in legal terms, I can ask myself the following questions. Was Henry Wriothesley the natural son of Elizabeth I and Edward de Vere? For certain? No. Beyond reasonable doubt? No. More likely than not? Yes. Circumstantial evidence? Strong. The multitude of other contemporary references and hints as to the real pedigree of Henry Wriothesley, of which I've given only a few examples, can now be considered in a new light. Thank you so much for getting this far. I hope you found it an interesting journey.